Welcome, mystery lovers, to another timeless tale of Father Brown. Tonight, we journey into a village shadowed by a towering spire, where pride hides in holy robes and judgment strikes like thunder from the heavens. Before we begin, tell us in the comments, where in the world are you tuning in from? And if you enjoy classic mysteries wrapped in atmosphere and moral depth, be sure to share this with your fellow mystery lovers. Now, let the bells toll, and the mystery unfold. Chapter 1. The Bells at Dusk. It began with the bells. They tolled across the little market town of Whodunit, their iron tongues striking through the September dusk with a measured, almost funereal gravity. Each note rolled over the clustered roofs and narrow cobbled lanes, reverberating as though the very stones of the houses were murmuring the sound back to heaven. It was not unusual for bells to ring in a town where church and vicarage stood proudly on the hill. But that evening, there was in their rhythm something disquieting, as if the metal voices themselves carried a secret they dared not name aloud. At the center of the town rose the ancient spire of St. Aloysius, its crooked silhouette dark against the bruised and restless sky. The sun had set, but not cleanly. Streaks of crimson and violet lingered like wounds across the horizon. Beneath this unsettled twilight, the town appeared both quaint and uneasy, as though it were a painted miniature suddenly jarred by some unseen hand. The respectable shopfronts with their sober lettering, the cottages with their neat gardens, the inn with its swinging sign of a boar's head, all seemed to shrink under the weight of that ringing. Father Brown, a short and round figure in a shabby clerical coat, was walking up the path toward the vicarage on the hill. To a stranger he might have looked comical, even trivial. A man who seemed to carry himself apologetically, with his umbrella tucked like an afterthought beneath his arm. But his small eyes, though mild, held the peculiar light of someone who had looked too often into the darker crevices of human souls. He paused at the foot of the hill and listened, his head cocked like a sparrow's, to the final toll of the bells. The vicarage stood beside the church, a handsome house of stone partly covered in ivy, with windows that caught the dying light like fragments of stained glass. It was here that Reverend Wilfred Bohun lived, a young clergyman of striking ascetic appearance, known for his stern sermons and his disdain for worldly frivolities. His brother, Colonel Norman Bohun, lived lower down the hill in the old manor house, and was of a different stamp altogether. A soldier returned from service abroad, robust, jovial, and as famous for his appetite for pleasure as Wilfred was for his restraint. Between them stretched both the slope of the hill and the unspoken tension of two natures in opposition. On this particular evening, however, Father Brown was not thinking of family quarrels or worldly vanities. He had been asked to visit Reverend Wilfred to discuss a matter of parish concern, a question of charity funds for the poor who dwelt in the cottages at the edge of the town. Yet as he climbed the path, he could not help noticing the peculiar stillness that hung over the place. The inn, usually raucous with voices even at dusk, was subdued. Shutters closed more quickly than usual, as though households wished to keep the twilight at bay. And all the while, those bells seemed to echo within him, leaving a vibration not of solemnity but of foreboding. The church itself loomed above, its great door carved with saints who, in the dimming light, appeared less like guardians than judges. Father Brown had often reflected that churches, when emptied of their worshippers, possessed an air at once sacred and sorrowful, like banquet halls after a feast. That night, however, there was an edge sharper than sorrow, something like the waiting hush before a storm breaks. As he reached the churchyard gate, he caught sight of a figure standing motionless near the lych gate. It was a tall man in military dress, his cloak thrown loosely over his shoulders, his hat tilted in a manner that might have been careless or insolent. Even in the failing light, the figure's confidence radiated like a flame. Colonel Norman Bohun was a man the town both admired and feared. Admired for his bravery, feared for his indulgences. Rumors clung to him like smoke, gambling debts, a scandal with a woman in the next county, quarrels that ended in blood. He greeted Father Brown with a laugh that sounded more like a challenge than a welcome. The little priest returned the greeting mildly, though inwardly he noted the restless gleam in the colonel's eye, the way his hand toyed with the hilt of the sword he wore even when off duty. Father Brown knew the type well enough. Men who wore their vitality like armor, yet were haunted by something within they dared not confront. It was not the colonel's sins that troubled him most, but the silence that followed his laughter, as if he too had heard the disquiet in the bells. From the upper windows of the vicarage, a dim light shone. There, Reverend Wilfred might be seen, his long, ascetic face bent over a book of sermons. Where Norman's figure was broad and brash, Wilfred's was narrow and pale, like a candle burned too quickly. The two brothers, bound by blood yet divided by temperament, seemed at that moment like two figures carved into the same coin, each bearing the outline of the other's fate. Father Brown, pausing in the churchyard, had the curious impression that the whole town was somehow gathered in this contrast. The worldly and the spiritual, the reckless and the restrained, the laughter of taverns and the silence of cloisters. And the bells, which had ceased now, seemed only to have deepened the stillness into something more ominous. Night settled. The inn lamps flickered below. The manor windows glowed like watchful eyes. And above all, the vicarage stood, a solitary sentinel against the sky. Father Brown adjusted his spectacles, looked once more at the two brothers divided by the slope of the hill, and felt, without yet knowing why, that he had stepped into a story already written, a pattern already woven. Somewhere in that darkening town, threads of pride and vengeance were drawing together, and soon, with a force as sudden as a hammer's blow, the pattern would reveal itself. Chapter 2. The Brothers of Bohun Magna. The town of Bohun Beacon, though small enough that each face was known, contained within its narrow boundaries the full spectrum of human ambition and frailty. It was a place where respectability and rumor lived side by side, where virtue was announced from pulpits yet whispered about over pints. And in the shadows of the tall church spire, its inhabitants moved as if upon a stage where every gesture might conceal a motive, and every silence a secret. The figure most visibly dominating this stage, at least in outward presence, was Colonel Norman Bohun. He strode through the marketplace as though it was still a parade ground, his boots clattering on cobblestones with martial certainty. Tall and broad-shouldered, his mustache bristled like a banner of command, and his cloak swung as if impatient to keep pace with his own vitality. Yet his confidence had the over-polished shine of something handled too often. There were evenings when his laughter seemed a little louder than the occasion required, or his boasts a shade too insistent, as if he shouted down not his companions but an inner voice that whispered of debts unpaid, promises broken, pleasures soured. In the tavern, he was adored, at least, for a time. Men followed him in drink, in wages, in tales of far-off battles, while women watched with that mix of admiration and unease that charm often breeds. But behind his geniality lingered a temper known to crack like a whip. More than once, a jest that cut too close had ended in threats, or worse, in the flash of the sword he carried even when it was not needed. Those who sang his praises in daylight sometimes spoke more cautiously of him in lamplight, when shadows lengthened, and the truth of his recklessness seemed harder to dismiss. In contrast, Reverend Wilfred Bohun was a man who seemed to shrink into the very stones of the vicarage. Tall in stature but thin almost to frailty, he moved with a kind of deliberate slowness, as if each step were weighed against eternity. His face, long and pale, was marked by eyes that burned with an inward fire, a gaze at once penetrating and austere. Parishioners admired his devotion, yet some confessed uneasily that his sermons carried a severity which left little room for mercy. Where Norman embraced the pleasures of the flesh, Wilfred seemed to deny not only indulgence but even the warmth of ordinary affection. He was a man who walked visibly with God, but perhaps less visibly with men. Still, there were those who defended him, insisting that his charity was quiet rather than absent. Indeed, it was Father Brown himself who often saw Wilfred distributing bread or tending the sick with a hand that trembled not from reluctance but from an intensity that verged on zeal. It was as though the vicar carried within him the unyielding conviction that salvation was won only through fire, and that fire consumed not only sins but sometimes the sinner. Between the brothers stretched more than the slope of the hill. There was a gulf of temperament so wide it seemed inevitable that sooner or later the chasm would demand a sacrifice. Beyond the brothers, the town had its chorus of secondary figures, each with their place in the unfolding drama. There was Mr. Gibbs, the landlord of the Boar's Head Inn, whose genial face mastered talent for keeping secrets. He knew more of debts, quarrels, and indiscretions than any man alive, yet his lips were sealed by a mixture of pragmatism and self-interest. He valued peace in his establishment, not because he feared trouble but because trouble drove away custom. Then there was Mrs. Sand, the churchwarden's wife, whose eyes were as sharp as pins and whose words could prick just as keenly. She carried herself as the moral conscience of the town, though her conscience had a curious way of bending to her own advantage. She admired Reverend Wilfred's piety, but it was whispered she admired even more the prospect of her niece marrying into the Bohun family, should Norman's wildness ever be tamed by matrimony. Among the humbler folk were the blacksmith, John Fletcher, whose forge glowed at the foot of the hill, and whose hammering often seemed to echo the toll of the bells. A burly man with hands like iron, Fletcher was respected for his craft and feared for his temper, though he was slow to speak and quicker to brood. His forge, ever burning, gave him the air of one who lived too close to elemental forces, as though each spark that flew from the anvil carried with it some fragment of his soul. Nearer the edge of town lived a sempstress, Mary Gray, a young woman whose beauty was less striking than it was serene. She moved quietly through the lanes with her basket of mending, her face pale but her eyes steady, and it was whispered that both Bohun brothers had noticed her in different ways. Norman, with his careless gallantry, had once paid her compliments that bordered on presumption, while Wilfred's interest was cloaked in the language of spiritual concern. Mary herself spoke little of either, carrying herself with the kind of composure that disarms gossip but does not silence it. And so the town was peopled with figures that, on the surface, lived ordinary lives. But beneath the still water of custom, eddies of envy, desire, and resentment swirled unseen. The tavern-keeper who owed the colonel favours he dared not refuse. The churchwarden's wife who measured piety in terms of family advantage. The blacksmith whose strength was legend, and whose patience was limited. The sempstress whose quiet presence seemed to hold the gaze of men far beyond her choosing. It was in such a setting that Father Brown found himself an observer. He did not judge with the harshness of Reverend Wilfred, nor indulge with the ease of Colonel Norman. Instead, he watched, listened, and, though he seldom appeared to be doing anything at all, he remembered. For the little priest knew that in a town where the church spire cast its shadow over every roof, sins did not vanish. They only disguised themselves in the folds of habit. And like moths circling a lamp, men's desires could not help but circle back to the flame that would consume them. Already, as night deepened over Bohun Beacon, those desires stirred in secret corners. The laughter of the inn carried uneasily into the street. A quarrel between two farmers broke out over nothing more than spilled ale. At the vicarage window, Wilfred's candle still burned, the flame long and narrow, like a finger pointing toward heaven or toward judgment. And in the manor house below, Colonel Norman's voice rose in some heated jest, loud enough to reach the lanes outside. The town listened, though it pretended not to, and Father Brown, standing once more in the churchyard, felt the shape of a tragedy forming. Chapter 3: Whispers Beneath the Spire. The days that followed were marked by a curious restlessness in Bohun Beacon, as though the town itself sensed a storm gathering behind the ordinary rhythm of its life. It was not that anything dramatic occurred. Rather, it was the small and scattered disturbances, each too slight to carry weight alone, that together created an air of disquiet. Like pebbles rolling before a landslide, these minor incidents foretold a heavier fall. It began with murmurs. The colonel's voice, carrying easily from the Boar's Head Inn, was heard to rise in sudden anger against the blacksmith Fletcher, who had entered reluctantly to collect payment long delayed. The quarrel lasted only minutes, broken up by the landlord's firm hand upon Norman Bohun's shoulder, but its echo lingered longer than the words themselves. Some swore they saw Fletcher's great hand clench upon his tankard until the pewter bent, while the colonel's laughter, loud and scornful, was followed by a silence that felt more menacing than a blow. Then came the sermon. Reverend Wilfred stood in the pulpit on Sunday, his lean figure towering above the congregation, his eyes burning with a strange fervor. He preached on the judgment of God with such vehemence that the air seemed to thicken in the nave. He spoke of pride brought low, of sinners who sought to scale the heavens only to be struck down by divine wrath, and of the hammer of God that falls suddenly, with righteous weight, upon the arrogant. Parishioners left the church in silence, unsettled rather than comforted. Some muttered that the vicar's words were aimed not at the general soul of man but at one soul in particular. And all eyes, when they slipped sideways, seemed to drift toward the broad shoulders of Colonel Norman, who sat near the back with an expression of bored disdain. Father Brown, too, heard the sermon, but his mind lingered not on its thunder but on the face of the man who delivered it. Wilfred's eyes blazed as though lit by something more consuming than pastoral concern. The priest knew the look, not from pulpits but from confessions, the look of a soul tempted to clothe personal bitterness in the language of divine justice. It was not the wrath of God that troubled him most, but the wrath of a man who believed himself God's instrument. Other disturbances followed, like distant tremors before an earthquake. A quarrel flared between Norman Bohun and Mrs. Sand, the churchwarden's wife, when she accused him, under her breath, though loud enough for others to hear, of corrupting the youth of the town with his reckless example. Norman retorted with a jest so cruel that her face stiffened as if struck, and she withdrew with lips pursed tight, her niece tugging nervously at her sleeve. Later that evening, Mrs. Sand was seen speaking intently with Reverend Wilfred near the churchyard, their figures dark against the lantern glow. Meanwhile, Mary Gray, the sempstress, moved silently through this brewing storm, her presence like a calm pool in a town of churning waters. Yet her calmness itself seemed to draw the tempest closer. Colonel Norman, flushed with wine, was said to have stopped her in the lane one evening, his laughter too hearty, his compliments too bold. She passed by with quiet dignity, her head lowered, her eyes steady, but those who witnessed the moment felt a discomfort that lingered after she had gone. Others whispered that Wilfred's gaze followed her too long when she entered church, though his concern was always wrapped in the cloth of pastoral duty. Thus, like threads drawn taut upon a loom, the lives of Bohun Beacon began to strain against one another. Pride against piety, strength against restraint, desire against dignity, each tension invisible yet felt, each pulling the town closer to a snapping point. The blacksmith's forge became a kind of symbol for the unease. Its fire roared late into the night, and the ringing of hammer upon anvil carried up the hill and down the lanes. To some, it was merely the rhythm of honest work. To others, it was an omen. Children whispered that the blacksmith was forging not plowshares but weapons, and one boy swore he had seen sparks leap higher than the roof, as if fire itself was straining to escape. The tale grew in the telling, until even sober men remarked that the hammering echoed too ominously with Wilfred's sermon of the hammer of God. Through it all, Father Brown remained an inconspicuous presence. He drifted in and out of scenes like a shadow, unremarked by those too intent on their quarrels. He sat quietly in the inn, sipping water while the colonel boasted. He lingered in the churchyard, listening as Wilfred counseled parishioners in tones that sometimes sounded more like condemnation than comfort. He spoke kindly with Mary Grey, never pressing her but noticing the flicker of unease in her otherwise steady eyes. He did not yet piece the fragments together. Instead, he gathered them like pebbles, patient as a man waiting for a tide to turn. One evening, as dusk fell and the lamps were being lit, Father Brown walked slowly along the slope between the manor and the vicarage. The hill seemed steeper that night, the shadows longer, the silence heavier. From above, the faint glow of Wilfred's study shone through the window. From below, the sound of Norman's laughter rang from the manor, carrying with it a strain that was more challenge than joy. The town was divided by the hill, just as the brothers were divided by their natures, and Father Brown felt in his bones that the hill itself would soon become a stage for judgment. The night deepened. A wind rose, rattling the shutters and tossing branches against roofs. Somewhere, a dog barked, then fell silent. And over it all came the steady toll of Fletcher's hammer, striking again and again, until it seemed less the sound of labor than the heartbeat of something vast and waiting. And in the pause between those blows, in the silence that fell too sharp and sudden, Father Brown thought he heard the whisper of inevitability, the hush that precedes not rumor, not quarrel, but the blow of fate itself. Chapter 4: Death in the Twilight. The night it happened was clear, the air sharpened by the chill that often follows a day of restless wind. The town of Whodunit lay tucked beneath the spire like a child beneath a stern parent, its cottages dim, its lanes quiet. Yet the stillness of that night carried not peace but the brittle silence of a room where an argument has only paused, not ended. Father Brown, returning late from a call on one of the poorer families at the edge of the town, passed once more beneath the slope that joined manor and vicarage. The sky above was scattered with stars, glittering coldly, as if the heavens themselves were a canopy of judgmental eyes. The priest paused, listening. From the manor came the muffled sound of revelry, a burst of laughter, then a clatter as of a cup knocked aside. From the vicarage, by contrast, no sound emerged, only the thin flame of Wilfred's candle, burning with solitary persistence in the upper window. It was then that the cry split the night. It was not the cry of one startled or wounded, but the terrible, ragged cry of a soul rent from its body, the kind of cry that leaves silence more awful than sound. It came from the lane between churchyard and forge, sharp and short, and then was gone, swallowed by the stillness. Father Brown's small frame stiffened. Without hesitation, he quickened his pace toward the sound. The scene that met him, as he rounded the churchyard wall, was stamped upon the memory of Whodunit for years to come. Beneath the great oak tree that shadowed the lane lay Colonel Norman Whodunit, sprawled upon the stones. His face, turned upward toward the indifferent stars, was grotesquely still, as though the laughter that so often filled it had been arrested in mid-breath. His sword lay beside him, unsheathed, but the weapon had done nothing to defend him. Above, the oak's gnarled branches clawed at the sky like blackened fingers, as if they too reached for heaven in witness or in guilt. The cause of death was horribly plain. His skull had been crushed with a single blow, so fierce and final that it left no room for struggle. Blood spread dark across the stones, glistening in the starlight, pooling with an obscenity that mocked the sanctity of the nearby churchyard. The colonel, so proud of his strength, so swift to anger, lay broken not by duel or by chance, but by the deliberate force of a hand that had struck with something heavy and merciless. Within minutes, the town was roused. Doors flung open, lanterns bobbed along the lanes, voices rose in shock and fear. Men hurried from the inn, women gathered shawls about their shoulders, children clung wide-eyed to their mothers' skirts. The cry had summoned them, and the sight held them fast. They clustered round the body in uneasy semicircle, their faces lit from below by the swaying lanterns, shadows leaping grotesquely across their features. The blacksmith Fletcher was among the first to arrive, his massive form towering over the others, his hands blackened with soot from the forge. He stared at the corpse with a grimness that might have been sorrow or something darker. Behind him, Mrs. Sand pressed a handkerchief to her lips, her eyes darting from the blood on the stones to the solemn spire above, as if she sought in vain for a moral lesson adequate to such a scene. At last, Reverend Wilfred emerged from the vicarage. His long figure descended the hill with slow, deliberate steps, his face pale in the lantern light, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that unsettled even in that moment of horror. He bent over his brother's body, but not with the grief one might expect. Instead, he stood erect after only a glance, his thin lips pressed tight, his eyes turned heavenward as if already pronouncing judgment. To some, his calm was admirable. To others, it was inhuman. Father Brown knelt beside the fallen colonel. He touched nothing, but his small eyes moved with quiet precision. He noted the position of the sword, the direction of the blood's flow, the curious angle of the head. He looked at the oak above, its branches heavy, and then at the stones below, where no weapon lay but the one the dead man had carried. The murmurs of the townsfolk grew louder. Fletcher the blacksmith, standing so near, with hands that could wield a hammer mighty enough to crush a skull, was he not the obvious suspect? More than one villager whispered of the quarrel at the inn, of debts unpaid, of threats exchanged. The hammer of a blacksmith was heavy enough, brutal enough, to match the wound. Eyes turned toward him, suspicion darkening like a cloud. Fletcher's face flushed beneath the scrutiny, and his hand tightened unconsciously around the lantern he held, until the metal creaked. But Father Brown did not join in their suspicion. He straightened slowly, his round figure casting a small, humble shadow against the church wall. His gaze moved from Fletcher's massive form to Wilfred's ascetic stance, from Mrs. Sand's furtive glance to Mary Gray's pale, still face among the onlookers. He saw, not weapons or wounds, but the intricate web of pride, envy, desire, and judgment that wound invisibly between them all. The constable at last pushed through the throng, flustered and uncertain. He asked the usual questions in a voice too loud for the hush of the scene. Who had last seen the colonel alive? Who had heard the cry? Who had quarreled with him that day? And though many tongues wagged, all seemed to circle back to the same uneasy conclusion. The blacksmith had both cause and strength. Yet as the constable fussed and the villagers whispered, Father Brown's gaze lingered upon the oak tree above the body. Its branches loomed like arms of judgment, heavy and stretching, as if they themselves might have struck the blow. The image stirred a thought, faint but insistent, at the back of his mind. A thought he did not yet voice, for it was not ready. The body was borne away at last, carried on a stretcher toward the inn where it might lie until burial. The townsfolk drifted reluctantly after, their whispers trailing behind like smoke. Only Father Brown remained a little while longer in the lane, his eyes lifted to the branches, his mind moving with the slow, steady patience of one who knows that the soul is more easily understood than the hand, and that the truth of a murder lies not only in what was done, but in why. Above him, the stars glittered indifferently. The hammer had fallen. The crime had been struck. And Bohun Beacon, trembling beneath its spire, waited to see upon whom judgment would descend. Chapter 5. The Blacksmith's Shadow. Morning broke over Bohun Beacon with a deceptive clarity. The sky washed in pale blue as though nothing foul had happened beneath it. Yet the town awoke to a different rhythm, one broken by gossip, suspicion, and fear. The murder of Colonel Norman Bohun had shaken the little community to its core, and by breakfast time, whispers had hardened into opinion, and opinion into something perilously close to judgment. The blacksmith Fletcher's name was on every tongue. He was strong enough, angry enough, and close enough to have dealt the blow. The quarrel at the inn had already been retold a dozen times, each telling adding sharper edges. Some said the colonel had taunted him beyond endurance. Others insisted Fletcher had sworn revenge. Even the sound of his hammer, echoing late into the night, seemed now to toll like a confession. People who had once nodded respectfully at him in the lane now crossed to the other side. And though no warrant had yet been drawn, the blacksmith felt the weight of invisible chains upon him. Fletcher himself bore the suspicion with a dangerous mixture of pride and resentment. When questioned by the constable, he admitted the quarrel, admitted his anger, but denied the act. His eyes, dark beneath their heavy brows, flashed with something perilously close to contempt as he answered. His hammer, he declared, had struck only iron, not flesh. Yet his very strength worked against him. The townsfolk could not imagine a hand so powerful failing to answer provocation with violence. Mrs. Sand, whose sharp tongue spared no one, was quick to declare Fletcher guilty. She repeated to anyone who would listen that his forge had burned past midnight, that she had heard the dreadful rhythm of hammering long after decent folk were abed. To her, the evidence was as plain as scripture. The blacksmith had exchanged his tool of labor for a weapon of wrath. Her words spread with the efficiency of fire among dry thatch, inflaming those already eager for certainty. Even Mary Gray, when questioned, could offer nothing in his defense beyond a quiet insistence that she did not believe him capable. But her soft voice was easily drowned by louder tongues, and some whispered that her sympathy sprang from pity rather than truth. The more she defended Fletcher, the more others suspected she was blinded by some hidden affection. Through all this, Reverend Wilfrid stood strangely aloof. His sermon the previous Sunday still echoed in people's minds, and many took it now as prophecy. Had he not spoken of the hammer of God falling upon the arrogant? And had it not fallen, literally, upon his own brother? When pressed for comment, Wilfrid merely lifted his long, pale face and said that the wages of sin are death, and that divine justice often employs human hands. Such words, uttered in tones of solemnity, seemed to confirm Fletcher's guilt rather than relieve it. Some praised the vicar's candor, others shuddered at his severity. It was Father Brown alone who moved quietly against the tide. He walked the lanes with his head bent, listening to each story without interruption, yet storing every contradiction with the patience of a man piecing together a puzzle. When told of Fletcher's midnight hammering, he asked softly whether any had seen him leave the forge that night. When assured of the blacksmith's wrath, he inquired whether wrath always led to murder. When reminded of Fletcher's strength, he observed that strength often breeds restraint, while weakness, under strain, may break into violence. These remarks, mild and almost childlike in tone, were dismissed by many. Father Brown, after all, was an outsider in the sense that he did not belong to the Bohun family or the town's daily intrigues. He was seen as harmless, even whimsical. Yet those who looked closer might have noticed the way his small eyes seemed to pierce beneath words, the way his plump fingers traced absent patterns on his umbrella handle as though drawing invisible lines between fragments no one else had joined. The constable, overwhelmed by pressure and short of evidence, began to lean toward arresting Fletcher. The townsfolk clamored for it, eager for the comfort of a culprit. Better a strong hand behind bars than a murderer at large, was the common refrain. And Fletcher, with his proud silence and smoldering glances, seemed to fit the part too well. His very refusal to plead for sympathy was taken as proof of guilt. But Father Brown was not satisfied. He had stood over the colonel's body, had seen the wound. It was indeed the work of a hammer or something like it, but there was a detail, a faint detail, that whispered otherwise. The angle of the blow, the position of the sword, the spread of the blood, it suggested not a brawl between equals, but a strike delivered from above, sudden and terrible. It was not the blow of a man swinging in rage face to face, but of someone standing higher, perhaps unseen until the moment of impact. That thought clung to him like a burr. He wandered once more to the oak tree where the crime had been committed. The villagers avoided the spot, but Father Brown lingered. He gazed upward into the branches, black against the daylight sky. They were sturdy enough to bear a man's weight, and the height was such that a blow struck from there would fall not only with human strength, but with the added force of gravity. The hammer of God, indeed, descending from above. As he stood there, lost in reflection, he heard footsteps approach. It was Wilfred, moving with his measured, solemn stride. He regarded the priest with an expression unreadable, somewhere between curiosity and irritation. His pale lips parted as though to speak, but then closed again. For a long moment, the two clergymen stood in silence beside the tree, one tall and ascetic, the other short and round. To a passerby, they might have seemed grotesquely mismatched figures in a painting. At last Wilfred said, in tones grave and final, that Fletcher would be punished, and that divine justice would not be mocked. Father Brown did not answer immediately. He looked again at the branches, then at Wilfred's eyes, which burned with something more than zeal. Only then did he murmur that sometimes men mistake their own wrath for the wrath of heaven. The words were spoken softly, but they fell into the silence like a stone dropped into a well, sending unseen ripples deep below. Wilfred turned sharply, his cloak brushing the grass, and strode back toward the vicarage. Father Brown watched him go, then lowered his gaze once more to the stones where Norman's blood had dried dark. The wrong suspect stood in peril, but the truth, he sensed, was far more terrible, and far closer to the spire than the town yet imagined. Chapter 6. The Priest Who Listened. The days that followed the murder fell upon Bohun Beacon with a strange and stifling weight. Though the sun rose and set as it always had, the village lived beneath an invisible shadow, a pressure that no light could dispel. The forge fires still burned, the shop doors still opened, but every errand was whispered, every face carried a question. Behind shutters, people muttered the same name, Fletcher, yet in their hearts unease stirred, for something in the tale rang incomplete. Father Brown moved among them like a small and quiet shadow, easily overlooked yet never idle. His presence seemed so mild that most dismissed him as a sympathetic listener rather than an investigator. But his plump hands folded behind his back and his head bent slightly forward told another tale. He was gathering, storing, sifting. His manner was one of listening more than speaking, yet every silence was a net in which small details caught. He began, as always, with the overlooked. He spoke with children playing near the green, and they told him of strange shapes against the moon that night. They swore they had seen someone high in the oak, though they had been shooed away before they could look closer. He nodded gently, making no comment, but the image etched itself into his mind. From the innkeeper, he learned more of the quarrel between Fletcher and the colonel. The innkeeper insisted the blacksmith had looked fit to kill, his huge fist clenched upon the mug until the wood creaked. Yet the colonel had laughed, had taunted, had mocked Fletcher's plain life and plain faith. Brown noted that the colonel's provocations were consistent. He seemed to have delighted in testing the limits of others' patience, as though daring them to strike. It was, the priest reflected, a dangerous sport. Mary Gray he visited next, finding her at the small cottage where she tended her few belongings with quiet care. She looked pale and weary, but her composure remained. Brown listened as she confessed her sorrow, not only for the colonel's death but for the shadow falling upon Fletcher. She admitted his temper, yet insisted she had seen him turn aside blows rather than strike them. Brown, with eyes gentle as candlelight, asked only whether she had seen Fletcher after the quarrel. She replied she had passed the forge and heard his hammer, steady and relentless, as though it were driving out anger with each strike. From such small accounts Brown wove his understanding. Fletcher was hot-tempered, yes, but his wrath had been transmuted into labor, not blood. His hammer fell upon iron, not bone. The details spoke to Brown like lines of scripture. The constancy of the rhythm, the visible pride in work, the channeling of anger into noise rather than violence. It was not the silence of a man concealing guilt, but the clamor of one too restless to sleep. Yet the shadow of suspicion did not lift. The constable prepared papers, and villagers whispered of the gallows. Father Brown, sensing the peril, turned his steps toward the vicarage. It was time, he thought, to hear what Reverend Wilfred had to say, not to the crowd, but in the intimacy of a smaller chamber. The vicar received him in his study, a room austere to the point of coldness. Books of theology lined the shelves, their spines unbroken, their dust undisturbed. The great window looked out upon the spire that pierced the sky, as though to remind any visitor of the church's authority. Wilfred stood tall in his cassock, his face carved in angles of severity, his hands folded as if in perpetual benediction. He spoke at length of sin, of the dangers of indulgence, of the justice of heaven. His words flowed like a sermon, heavy with scripture, yet oddly detached from the human sorrow of the moment. Brown, seated low in a chair, listened with an expression that was almost dreamy, as though the words were washing over him without resistance. But in truth, he heard every syllable. When Wilfred declared that Fletcher's crime was a warning to all who let wrath master them, Brown lifted his round face and asked in his quiet way whether wrath always strikes outward, or whether sometimes it strikes downward from above. The vicar stiffened, his lips pressed thin. For a moment, something dangerous glinted in his eyes. Then he spoke of mysteries too deep for common minds, of the inscrutable will of God. It was enough. Brown left the vicarage with a certainty forming in his mind, though not yet the proof. He walked once more to the oak tree, pausing at its roots as though conversing with an old companion. The branches, thick and low, seemed to whisper back their secret. He imagined a figure, tall and thin, climbing under cover of dusk, waiting with patient breath until the victim approached. The hammer descending would seem not merely a human blow but a judgment from the sky. Still, he needed more. Proof, not only for his mind but for the town. A priest's conviction must be tempered with justice. An innocent man must not suffer for another's guilt. Thus Brown set about weaving a subtle net, one that would draw the truth into daylight. He began to speak more openly in the village, but always in riddles. He mentioned the curious height of the wound, the strange angle of the blow, the testimony of children who had seen shadows in the tree. He suggested that wrath can disguise itself as righteousness, and that sometimes the devil quotes scripture with alarming accuracy. His words unsettled some, angered others, but they sowed a seed of doubt against the easy certainty of Fletcher's guilt. At the forge, Fletcher looked at him with suspicion but also with a flicker of hope. Mary Gray's eyes filled with quiet gratitude, though she dared not speak it aloud. And Wilfred, hearing whispers of Brown's questions, grew colder, more severe, more insistent that judgment must be swift. The trap was nearly ready. Brown knew he must wait for the right moment, the right setting, when appearances would no longer protect the guilty. The oak tree had seen a crime in darkness. It would see a revelation in light. Chapter 7, A Test in Silence. The village simmered like a cauldron, restless and uneasy. By the end of the week, the constable had nearly convinced himself that Fletcher must be taken in chains. Yet something, perhaps Father Brown's quiet persistence, perhaps an instinct too dim to name, kept him from the final act. The people were impatient, their judgment ready, but the law hesitated. It was in this gap between suspicion and justice that Father Brown set his plan. He knew that truth often hides not in darkness but in light, revealed when a man believes himself unseen. To catch it, he must create a moment so ordinary, so harmless, that masks would fall away. Thus he proposed, with the mildest of smiles, a gathering beneath the oak tree itself. His reason was practical enough. to hold a short prayer of remembrance for the soul of Colonel Norman, whose death still haunted the parish. None could object to such piety, though some whispered that it was morbid to pray where the blood had dried. Still, curiosity overcame reluctance, and the townsfolk agreed. On the appointed afternoon, the village drifted toward the oak, their steps hushed, their eyes wary of shadows. Fletcher came, stiff and silent, his blacksmith's arms crossed like iron bars across his chest. Mary Gray followed at a little distance, her face pale but resolute, unwilling to abandon him in his hour of suspicion. The constable hovered near, eager for any slip that might confirm guilt. Mrs. Sand, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, stood ready to declare Fletcher's damnation at the first sign. Reverend Wilfred arrived last, tall and solemn in his cassock, his long face carved as though from marble. He stood beneath the branches with a severity that seemed part of the tree itself, as if the spire of his soul had rooted into the earth. To the villagers, his presence lent weight to the occasion. To Father Brown, it was the piece most carefully placed upon the board. The small priest led the prayer in his gentle, unassuming way. His voice was low, his words simple, invoking mercy for the dead and peace for the living. The crowd bowed their heads, some sincerely, others distracted by morbid curiosity. When he finished, he lifted his round face and remarked, almost casually, that the oak was a strange witness, seeing both the sins of men and the punishments that follow. Then, with the innocence of a child pointing to the sky, he asked whether any among them had wondered how such a blow could fall from above. His hand rose, gesturing toward the heavy branch that stretched overhead. A murmur ran through the crowd, for none had thought of it in so plain a manner. The constable frowned, puzzled. Mrs. Sand clicked her tongue but said nothing. Fletcher looked startled, his eyes narrowing as though some hope had kindled. Mary Gray's lips parted, as if on the edge of prayer. And Reverend Wilfred shifted, ever so slightly, his eyes darting upward to the very branch Brown had indicated. It was a glance swift as a bird's flight, but sharp enough to pierce the priest's heart with certainty. Brown let the silence stretch, as though he had said nothing remarkable. Then, in a tone almost conversational, he suggested that whoever struck the colonel must have stood higher than him, waiting with patience until the victim came beneath. It was a thing, he added gently, that required not strength but opportunity. Indeed, even a man without great muscle might achieve it, if he but chose his perch. The crowd stirred. Fletcher's massive arms suddenly seemed less condemning, his hammer blows in the forge less sinister. The suspicion that had weighed so heavily upon him began to thin, like mist before the sun. Eyes turned instead to the oak, to its branches thick and strong, and to the notion that guilt might lie not in the forge but in the heights. Wilfred spoke then, his voice sharp, more sermon than speech. He declared that speculation was dangerous, that the minds of men should not wander into dark corners best left to God. Yet his words rang too loud, too forceful, as though meant to smother doubt rather than dispel it. Brown, watching with his small, steady eyes, noted the tremor beneath the vicar's severity. The priest's trap was closing, not with iron jaws but with gentle inevitability. He asked, almost playfully, whether anyone here had ever climbed the oak as a child. Laughter broke the tension for a moment as some recalled scraped knees and broken branches. Even Fletcher managed a grim smile. Brown's gaze, however, remained fixed upon Wilfred, who alone did not smile. His face had grown paler still, and his hands clasped tighter, as though holding back an invisible weight. To seal the test, Brown suggested that one might easily prove the possibility. He pointed to a young lad in the crowd, nimble as only youth can be, and asked him to climb the lower branch. The boy, eager for notice, scrambled upward, settling on the very perch that overlooked the spot where Norman had fallen. The crowd gasped, for the angle was perfect, One could strike downward unseen, and the victim would never suspect until the blow had fallen. A silence deeper than any prayer descended. All eyes turned back to Wilfred, who stood rigid as stone, his lips pressed white. It was not Fletcher, nor Mary, nor the constable who revealed his guilt. It was his own face, drawn tight with dread, that betrayed him. Father Brown lowered his gaze, merciful rather than triumphant, as though mourning what he had forced into light. The trap had sprung, yet no chains had been laid. Brown asked no more, offered no accusation. He merely folded his hands and murmured that the hammer of God falls not from branches but from the burden of sin carried too long. The villagers heard it as a sermon, but Wilfred heard it as judgment. His shoulders sagged, the first crack in the marble statue, and his eyes fell not upon Fletcher but upon the ground where his brother's blood had dried. The crowd dispersed slowly, unsettled, whispering among themselves. Some doubted still, some began to suspect, but all felt that something hidden had shifted. Fletcher stood freer than before, though the shadow of accusation had not yet entirely lifted. Mary walked beside him, relief softening her face. And Wilfred returned to the vicarage alone, his long figure cutting against the sky like a spire leaning under storm. Father Brown lingered last, gazing up into the branches, his lips moving in a prayer none could hear. The trap had been laid, the mask had cracked, but the full revelation was yet to come. Chapter 8. The Hand That Struck from Heaven. The village did not sleep easily after the gathering beneath the oak. The prayer had been brief, but its aftermath lingered like incense in the air, sweet to some, suffocating to others. For the first time, Fletcher's neighbors looked at him not only as a suspect but also as a man who might be innocent. For the first time, whispers touched the vicar himself, though cautiously, as though one might blaspheme merely by entertaining the thought. Father Brown spent that evening in the rectory parlor, seated quietly while the constable paced back and forth. The man of law was torn between suspicion and incredulity. He admitted that Fletcher's guilt no longer seemed inevitable. The demonstration in the oak had unsettled him. Yet to imagine the vicar, so solemn, so ascetic, so devoted, as the killer was almost beyond belief. Brown did not argue. He merely sat with his small hands folded on his umbrella, watching the constable's restless feet, until the man grew weary of speaking into silence. It was not argument that would reveal the truth, but confrontation. And so, when dawn came pale and cold, Father Brown walked alone to the vicarage. He found Wilfred in the study, the long figure bent over his desk, though whether in prayer or pretense could not be discerned. The room was chill despite the season, as though warmth itself had been exiled. Father Brown did not sit. He remained standing, his round silhouette oddly out of place against the severe geometry of books and spire-shaped window. He began with a kindness that might have disarmed another man. He spoke of sorrow, of the heaviness of judgment, of how priests bear burdens unseen by their flocks. He remarked gently that those who stand too high upon spires may mistake themselves for God, forgetting they are but men. Wilfred's lips tightened, but he said nothing. Brown's eyes, small and patient, rested on him with a compassion that felt heavier than accusation. He spoke of the colonel's arrogance, of his worldly excess, of the way his life had mocked restraint. He admitted that Norman had invited wrath, and that many would see his death as a form of justice. Then, softly, he asked the question that hung between them. Was it divine justice, or human wrath wearing the mask of heaven? For a moment Wilfred's composure cracked. His long fingers trembled upon the desk. His voice, when it came, was hoarse, not with confession but with desperate justification. He said that some sins cry out for judgment louder than others, and that sometimes a man must act when the world is too weak. His words, though solemn, rang hollow in the small room, the echoes of a man persuading himself. Brown did not rebuke him with thunder. He merely lowered his gaze, as if in sorrow, and spoke of a truth deeper than sermons. That sin cannot be slain by sin, that the hammer of God does not rest in human hands, however righteous they may appear. He described the scene by the oak, not as accusation but as remembrance. A tall man upon a branch, a hammer lifted high, the moment of terrible silence before it fell. Each word painted the crime with such quiet accuracy that Wilfred flinched, as though the blow were being repeated upon his soul. At last, Wilfred spoke, and it was not the voice of a vicar but of a weary man. He confessed not in words of guilt but in words of grief. He said that his brother's life had been an open insult to all that was sacred, that his blasphemy had rung louder than any bell. He said he had prayed for patience, prayed for endurance, but in the end had seen himself as the hand of judgment. The oak had offered height, the hammer had offered certainty. He believed, in that dreadful moment, that he was the instrument of heaven. Father Brown listened without interruption, his round face grave, his eyes sad. When Wilfred's words faltered into silence, Brown spoke but once more. He said that the devil often tempts men not with evil but with pride, offering them the role of God himself. He said that true judgment belongs to heaven alone, and that when men seize it for themselves, they do not rise but fall. The silence that followed was heavier than stone. Wilfred sank into his chair, his tall frame bent as though under invisible chains. He did not cry out, nor did he plead. He merely sat, hollow and defeated, as though the spire within him had crumbled. When the constable was summoned, he entered the study with disbelief etched upon his face. To take the vicar into custody seemed to him a sacrilege. Yet Wilfred offered no resistance. He rose, placed his hands before him, and walked as one already condemned, not by law but by conscience. The townsfolk who saw him led away stood in stunned silence. Some wept, some prayed, and some turned their eyes toward Father Brown with new respect, and perhaps new fear, for he had unmasked what none had dared to imagine. Fletcher was freed of suspicion, though his pride left him scarred by the ordeal. Mary Gray stood beside him, her quiet loyalty vindicated, though her heart was heavy with sorrow for the fallen vicar. The oak tree remained, a grim witness to folly disguised as righteousness. And the spire above the village seemed less like a symbol of heaven and more like a warning of the heights from which men may fall. As for Father Brown, he spoke little. He walked the narrow lanes with the same mild air as before, greeting children, blessing cottages, pausing to look up at the sky as if in silent prayer. When asked how he had solved the mystery, he answered only that one must look not at the strength of the hand but at the weakness of the soul. For it is not always the mighty who strike in wrath, but those who mistake their own pride for God's will. Chapter 9. The Weight of Pride. When the vicar was taken from the village, the silence that followed was stranger than any uproar. People who had demanded Fletcher's arrest now kept their shutters closed and their tongues still. It was as though the entire community had been caught staring into a mirror and found a face they did not wish to see. The spire that had loomed so proudly above them seemed less a finger pointing to heaven than a blade suspended over their heads. Father Brown, walking through the quiet streets, carried no triumph. He had solved a crime, yes, but what lay beneath it was not a puzzle of tools and alibis. It was the darker puzzle of the soul, that bottomless cavern where pride and piety mingle until they are indistinguishable. For him, the revelation was less about guilt than about the fragility of virtue. In his heart, he reflected that men are often ruined not by what is worst in them but by what is best, twisted from its true course. Reverend Wilfred had been earnest, devout, and ascetic. He had stripped away earthly pleasures, had devoted himself to Scripture, had labored for his parish. Yet in the very height of his virtue, pride had crept in unnoticed. He had come to believe that his severity was not merely his duty but his identity, that he was chosen to wield judgment. And when his brother mocked heaven openly, Wilfred mistook his own fury for the hand of God. This, Brown mused, was the most dangerous temptation of all. A drunkard may know his weakness, a thief his sin, but the righteous may fall without suspecting it. For pride wears the mask of virtue, and wrath the mask of justice. The colonel had indeed been guilty of arrogance, of indulgence, of treating others as toys in his worldly games. But his punishment had not come from God. It had come from the hand of a man who forgot he was a man. Brown thought also of Fletcher. The blacksmith, coarse and hot-tempered, had been suspected because his strength was plain to see. Yet strength, when confronted with temptation, had been tempered by discipline. Fletcher had chosen the forge over violence, his hammer falling not on flesh but on iron. In the eyes of men, he looked the more dangerous. In the eyes of God, perhaps the more innocent. It was a reminder that appearances deceive, that the soul's battles are often opposite to what the world imagines. He remembered Mary Grey, pale and steadfast, whose quiet loyalty had kept her from abandoning the man accused. It was not strength of arms nor eloquence of speech that preserved justice in her heart, but the strength of love, humble, patient, enduring. And perhaps, Father Brown thought, love is the true hammer of God, not the blow that destroys but the force that endures until falsehood breaks of its own weight. As he walked, the bells of the church tolled once more. Their sound, which had heralded death days before, now seemed softer, like a weary sigh. Brown paused to listen, tilting his round head as though to catch a secret meaning in their tone. Bells, he thought, are like men. They can sound warnings or promises, doom or hope, depending on who listens. To some, they had tolled for Norman Bohun, the sinner cut down in his pride. To others, they tolled for Wilfred, the saint brought low by pride disguised as sanctity. But to Brown, they tolled for all men, for every soul that thinks itself beyond weakness. Later that evening, when the constable asked him why he had suspected Wilfred rather than Fletcher, Brown answered with characteristic simplicity. He said that Fletcher was too obvious, too strong, too angry to be the true culprit. Crimes of passion are loud, messy, direct. But this one had been patient, deliberate, descending like judgment from above. It was not the blacksmith's nature but the vicar's posture, aloof, severe, looking down from heights, that revealed the truth. For those who live too high above men sometimes strike down, imagining themselves to be instruments of heaven. The constable shook his head, still troubled by the thought of arresting a clergyman. Brown only patted his arm with a gentleness that seemed almost parental. He said that holiness is not found in garments or in sermons, but in humility, in knowing that no man may wield the hammer of God without breaking himself beneath it. The villagers, slowly, began to resume their lives. The forge rang once more with honest blows. Mary Grey walked with Fletcher in the lanes, their steps unhurried, their silence companionable. Yet beneath every routine, a faint unease lingered, as though the spire itself reminded them that even the heights are not safe from corruption. Father Brown, meanwhile, resumed his quiet ways, offering counsel where needed, prayers where sought, and small acts of kindness where unnoticed. To some, he seemed unchanged. To others, he seemed heavier, as though bearing not only his own sins but those of all he met. Yet his face remained mild, even cheerful, for he knew that sorrow must always be tempered with hope. In his thoughts, the true hammer of God was not iron nor wrath, but grace, invisible, persistent, striking not from above but within. It is the hammer that breaks pride into repentance, that shatters wrath into mercy, that turns even sin into the soil of humility. And it is that hammer, not the one that fell from an oak branch, that resounds through the ages, whether men listen or not. Chapter 10. The Road Beyond the Spire. The village of Bohun Magna settled back into its rhythms, But the settlement was not the same as before. The forge rang again with the measured beat of the hammer, but each strike carried a new resonance, as though Fletcher himself knew the difference between destruction and creation more clearly than ever. The shopkeepers opened their shutters, though they glanced often toward the tall spire, wary of the pride that had lurked so close to its base. Even children played with a quieter cheer, their laughter rippling across the lanes with a restraint born not of fear but of awareness. Life had resumed, yet it carried the faint mark of mourning that never wholly leaves a place touched by both death and revelation. Father Brown remained for several days after the vicar's arrest, though no one quite remembered asking him to stay. He was seen strolling the crooked streets, listening to the concerns of widows, or standing by the forge as Fletcher worked, murmuring small comments that seemed trivial but left the blacksmith oddly consoled. He dined with Mary Gray and her family one evening, speaking more of gardens than of crime. Yet Mary felt that in his round face and small eyes there was a kindness deeper than pity, a reminder that faith is not thunder but light that lingers. On the last morning, he stood outside the inn with his battered umbrella in one hand and his worn brown hat in the other. The coach that would take him toward the next parish had not yet arrived, and he seemed in no hurry. Instead, he watched the village as a man might watch the sea retreat after a storm, noting how every puddle reflected the sky, how every broken branch had fallen into its own place. The constable approached, still uneasy with the duty he had carried out. He remarked, almost apologetically, that it was hard to think of a clergyman as a murderer, harder still when that clergyman had seemed so upright, so removed from the coarser temptations of the world. Father Brown listened with the same mild patience he gave to all things. He replied that temptation does not always wear a wicked face. Sometimes it looks like virtue polished too bright, a zeal sharpened into judgment, a pride hidden under prayers. He told the constable that men are not divided into saints and sinners but are a patchwork of both, stitched with weaknesses and graces in equal measure. The constable, sighing, asked if the spire now seemed to Father Brown a monument to hypocrisy rather than to heaven. Brown tilted his head, considering the question as though it were not rhetorical but worthy of true thought. At last he answered that the spire was still a finger pointing upward. It was only men who mistook it for a sword to strike downward. Its height was meant to lift eyes to the sky, not to lower wrath upon earth. And so, the spire remained innocent, silent, steadfast, waiting for men to learn its true lesson. As they spoke, Fletcher came down the lane with Mary Gray at his side. Their steps were slow, deliberate, and though the blacksmith carried the heaviness of recent days, there was also a steadiness in his manner that had not been there before. He greeted Father Brown awkwardly, unsure how to thank a man who had restored his honor and his freedom. Brown spared him the effort with a small, almost comical nod, remarking only that it was good to see the forge working again. For in that simple hammering, there was more salvation than in all the judgments men try to cast upon one another. The coach arrived at last, creaking into the village square. Its wheels stirred dust, its horses pawed impatiently at the cobbles. Brown mounted the steps slowly, with the clumsy care of a man unused to travel, then turned to look once more at the place. The villagers had gathered at a distance, not in ceremony but in the curious way people come to mark a moment they cannot name. Their eyes followed the little priest, not as one who had unmasked a killer but as one who had reminded them of their own frailty. Before taking his seat, Father Brown lifted his hat slightly, not as a grand gesture but as though shading his eyes from the morning sun. He spoke quietly, so that only those nearest heard him, yet the words seemed to ripple outward, carried by the hush of the village. He said that men should beware of climbing too high to strike, for the hammer of God is not in the hand that smites but in the heart that repents. With that, he settled into the coach, and the horses pulled away. The spire, stark against the pale sky, remained in sight long after the road turned and the houses dwindled. To some, it looked sharper than ever, like a warning. To others, it gleamed as a reminder of heaven above even the frailty of men. But to Father Brown, already nodding drowsily in his seat, it was simply what it had always been. A pointer upward, a summons to humility, a call to remember that God strikes not as man strikes but with a mercy beyond measure. And so the village, having seen death descend and pride exposed, carried on with quieter steps and humbler hearts. The bells tolled again at evening, neither of doom nor of victory but of endurance, ringing across the fields like the echo of a truth too simple to be forgotten. And so ends this haunting tale of pride, wrath, and the quiet wisdom of Father Brown. What did you think of the revelation? Did you suspect the true hand behind the crime? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. If this story kept you guessing, share it with your fellow mystery fans, and subscribe for more timeless detective tales that intrigue the mind and stir the soul. Until next time, may the mystery stay alive in your heart.